So, now let's talk about defining language. So when a player engages for the first time in a game, they begin a learning process, sort of feeling out the ways that they can direct their character and interact with the world. Soon they learn intuitively how to move, what shapes they can move on and what shapes impede movement. Maybe they learn to jump, what shapes they learn what shapes are low enough to jump onto and which shapes are too high. Although many games might share sort of similarities in how they signal these environmental utilities, each game is a little bit different. It takes time for players to understand interactions with the environment intuitively enough for it to become second nature. So this is the second major role of levels. Environments are teachers, and what we're teaching is the grammar and language of our game. So Chris Crawford wrote a book, Interactive Storytelling, I think in 2005, 2007. This is a quote from it. Interactivity requires verb thinking. Verb thinking. So it's been said that one of the strong points of games as a medium is an action, and that's how the player interacts with a game, is through action, through verbs. So let's talk a little bit more, though, about verbs and the rest of grammar and how they relate to games. So let's look at this quick quote here. The player sneaks slowly across the overgrown yard, jumps over the narrow gap, and quietly takes cover behind the wood pile. Okay. Essentially, this is describing a situation that could happen in a game, and it's describing it with the natural grammar that we use every day. And that grammar is made up of verbs, nouns, adverbs, and adjectives, as well as there's plenty of other parts of sentence like prepositions, conjunctions, so on. But the fundamental sort of ideas here are communicated through those four types of words. So if we look at the example, for instance, the verbs, the actions, here are sneaks, jumps, and takes cover. So verbs are action words. In a game, these are essentially what makes up the player's mechanics. Maybe the player can walk, jump, sprint, throw fireballs, smash their head into things. The player needs to be taught what verbs they have and how to map those actions through control input. Some verbs are only available in certain contexts, like when you get a power-up, when you pick up a certain item, sometimes when you're in the menu. And it takes time and practice for players to develop use of verbs in a new game, but we may be familiar with the concept of jumping, for instance, in real life, but pressing a button to jump is something that's a little unnatural and removed from our real lived experience. Though it's likely something that players have done in other games, they probably jumped in other games. Every game's a little different in their timings, their height, their language, their length. The verbs that are contextually available in a jump state, like grab ledge, attacks, or double jump. Also as important is understand the verbs that are able to be used by NPCs. Do they have a verb set similar to the player, or is it more limited? Maybe they have new verbs. So nouns. Nouns in the sentence are player, yard, gap, and pile. So nouns are words that represent objects, persons, or ideas. Characters like the player and the obvious, and NPCs, of course, are obvious nouns, but there are sort of a myriad of things like doors, ladders, chairs, ammo, bottomless pits. A noun applied to a shape in your layout means that it has identity, it has purpose or agency. It can easily apply to the story of the player's experience. When shapes can't be named, their existence as being distinct from the background, and their applicability in the player's narrative becomes blurred. So nouns take on several roles in how verbs interact with them. Nouns and noun phrases can be a subject, a direct object, or an indirect object. Let's look at this nice little sentence. The player threw a brick at the bandit's head. So the player is the subject, the noun that is able to perform an action. The brick is the direct object. A brick is a noun that verbs act upon. And the head, the bandit's head specifically, is an indirect object, meaning that it is an action that can be performed for or in relation to. Indirect objects, essentially an indirect object or an object of a preposition. Adverbs. So adverbs are words that modify or qualify verbs. In this sentence, we've got slowly, over, and quietly. So slowly affects sneaks, over affects jumps, and so on. So imagine if you were playing a game where you could jump, but you could also jump carefully. That could possibly mean that the player themselves is being attentive or careful, but what if you could jump high or jump low? You had that sort of control, or you could move fast and move slowly. Now, I mean, it would seem that jump has a range of movement to that height, and move would have a range of speed associated with that action. When you're able to apply adverbs to an action in your game, it's sort of an indicator of mechanical depth. It means that players have a spectrum of choice within their learned vocabulary of actions. So the first step to creating a game with mechanical depth is to rely on a couple of simple adverbs. Specifically, in any interaction, is there a range to which that on one side of the spectrum a player can carry it out poorly, and on the other side of that spectrum is the player able to perform it well? How far apart is that divide? So we often strive for mechanics that are said to be easy to learn, hard to master. And essentially what that means is that player input matching to the verb is intuitive, and that how those verbs act on nouns is simple and natural. But mastering, creating something that can be mastered, is also in the subtleties of the interactions. It's in the adverbs. Lastly, and I hope you're still with me here, adjectives. Adjectives modify nouns. So here we've got overgrown, narrow, and woodpile, or wood, which modifies pile. So I mean, just as adverbs are modified verbs, adjectives are the modifier of nouns. They're what gives nouns their identity and purpose. Smooth, round, steep, wide, spiky, deep, massive, bushy. In a game environment, it's the adjectives that speak to players on the most basic level of their perception. So adjectives really are the bread and butter of layout designers, and it's something we're really going to be expanding on in the next couple of weeks. Players see our shapes, and the adjectives we've assigned to them give meaning to form, such as the red cylindrical object over there is an exploding barrel, or the rectangular open space high in the wall, that's a window. There's another one low in the wall, it's a door. Adjectives link nouns with verbs. So where is this getting us? I know you probably hoped that you left grammar far behind in your elementary school, that sort of thing. But it's really not a stretch to apply grammar rules like this as a metaphor for game interaction. Grammar is how we humans order our thoughts. Through grammar, the player will, at least we hope, excitedly describe their experience in your game to their friends. When playing the game, they will subconsciously construct sentences describing their interactions. based on the judgment of environmental conditions. In your game, your level is going to speak back to them. The game acts as a communication pipeline between the designer and the player. Your level presents the player with new ideas and prompts them to answer, to input. In this respect, we really harken back to old text-based adventure games. So here's a little snippet from me playing the start of Zork 1. West of house. This is an open field west of a white house with a boarded front door. There is a small mailbox here. A rubber mat saying, "Welcome to Zork," lies by the door. Open the mailbox. You open the mailbox, revealing a small leaflet. I'll read the leaflet. We'll just leave it at that. But so the game here is presenting the player with the context of the world, with nouns to perform actions on, adjectives giving identity to those nouns. Then it's the player's turn to respond back with the verbs describing their intentions on the world and on the nouns within them. So in a game like Zork, the player is actually typing out that grammar of that interaction. In a game like Super Mario Brothers, for instance, the player also is communicating that those verbs, though they're not actually typing it out in words, they're speaking their intentions through a continuous button input that's sort of conceptually mapped to that grammar. Move forward, sprint forward, jump, move backwards, wait a moment, move forward and jump on the enemy's head. And in response, the game constantly updates the player on the state of affairs following the input of those actions. What was the result? What comes next as the player moves through the world? As the game designers, we also tend to communicate in a more continuous and analog way compared to the designers of Zork, for instance. Instead of speaking sentences, we speak through a grammar of shape. And in order to do this well, we need to develop tools. We need to be able to articulate clearly a consistent shape language in our layouts. So we've really come a long way from board games and from the days of video games like this. When you're creating sort of pixel art in 8 colors, there's really little room to be able to create anything but what is absolutely necessary to play the game. A brick has to be a brick. There's really not a whole lot of extra stuff here. Form and its function could hardly stray very far from one another. In fact, function usually came first, and the form simply gave context to that function, which is a relationship leading to many bizarrely endearing characters and game worlds, like this one, for instance. So today, however, the role of story and world narrative often plays a much larger part of the design process of games. So in a way, that's really wonderful how we are finding ways to tell compelling stories in our medium, but the focus shift that occurs there can tend to sort of reverse the game-centric flow of function before form. And that, given with the amount of technical rendering power and capability at our disposal, it's very easy and very tempting to stray away from the practical purpose of game level environment and just kind of get lost in the artistry of creating breathtaking visual spaces. But when we do, it's as if when we're speaking to the player through our shapes, we mumble and slur our speech. We are leaving them to guess at our meaning. Players may marvel at the beauty of our game spaces, but then are lost in how they can interact with them. So it falls to the environment designer to be vigilant in trying to write that design dynamic. How do the forms of your level match with game mechanics? And how does that match the grammar of player interaction? How do the shapes act as a communication medium?